Dog refuses food for days. Owner discovers heartbreaking reason. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Lisa's small home, filling the cozy kitchen with a soft golden glow. The smell of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and the sound of birds chirping outside promised a beautiful day ahead. At the center of it all sat Max, her loyal brown and white dog, curled up near his food bowl. Normally, this was his favorite spot in the morning. He would sit there, his tail wagging eagerly as Lisa poured kibble into his shiny metal bowl. He'd gobble up his food with enthusiasm, his happy munching filling the quiet space. But today was different. Lisa frowned as she glanced down at him. "Come on, Max," she said softly, crouching beside him and giving his head a gentle pat. "It's breakfast time. I know you're hungry." Max didn't move. He stared at the bowl in front of him with sad, distant eyes, his ears drooping low. Lisa sighed, brushing a strand of hair out of her face. "You've been doing this for 2 days now, buddy. What's wrong?" Her voice was full of concern, but Max didn't respond. He simply let out a small whimper and rested his chin on the floor beside the untouched food bowl. Lisa stood up, her worry deepening as she studied him. Max wasn't the kind of dog to turn down a meal. He was always ready to eat, no matter what. At first, she thought he might just be feeling a little under the weather, but now 2 days had passed, and he still wouldn't touch his food. "This isn't like you," she muttered to herself, pulling her phone out of her pocket. She scrolled through her contacts, hovering over the number for the vet before shaking her head. "Maybe it's nothing," she whispered, as if trying to convince herself. "I'll keep an eye on you today. Okay, Max? Maybe you'll feel better soon." Max lifted his head slightly at the sound of her voice, but his eyes were still heavy with sadness. Lisa's chest tightened as she knelt back down and cupped his face in her hands. "Hey," she whispered, her voice soft. "It's okay. Whatever's bothering you, we'll figure it out. I promise." Max nuzzled his head against her hand, his eyes flickering with a brief moment of warmth before he laid back down again. The day passed slowly, and Lisa's concern grew with each hour. She tried everything to get Max to eat. She added treats to his food, warmed up some chicken broth, and even brought out his favorite peanut butter-filled chew toy, but nothing worked. Max would sniff the food half-heartedly and then look away, retreating to the corner of the living room where he lay down with a soft, defeated sigh. Lisa sat on the couch, watching him with a knot of worry in her stomach. "What is going on with you?" she whispered. She picked up her phone and searched for answers online. "Why won't my dog eat?" The search results flooded her screen. Articles about picky eaters, stomach issues, and emotional distress. She clicked through each one, scanning the words and looking for anything that might explain Max's behavior. By evening, she couldn't take it anymore. She called the vet. "Hi, Dr. Peters. It's Lisa," she said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke into the phone. "I think something's wrong with Max. He hasn't been eating for days." Dr. Peters' voice was calm and reassuring. "That does sound concerning, Lisa. Have there been any other symptoms? Vomiting, diarrhea, lethargy?" "No, nothing like that," Lisa replied, glancing at Max, who was curled up on the floor, his eyes half closed. He looks sad. And he's not eating. It's like he's lost interest in everything." Dr. Peters paused for a moment. "It's possible that Max is experiencing some emotional distress. Has anything changed in his routine recently? A new person, a move, the loss of someone close to him?" Lisa frowned, her mind racing. "No, nothing's changed. At least, I don't think so." "Bring him in tomorrow," Dr. Peters said gently. "We'll take a look and run a few tests to be sure there's nothing physically wrong. In the meantime, just keep an eye on him and try to keep him comfortable." "Okay," Lisa murmured. "Thank you, Dr. Peters." As she hung up the phone, Lisa looked at Max, her heart aching. He hadn't moved from his spot on the floor, his body curled up like he was trying to make himself smaller. It broke her heart to see him like this. Max had always been so full of life, his tail wagging, his tongue hanging out in a happy pant, always ready to play or cuddle. But now he looked so lost. Lisa knelt beside him, stroking his fur gently. "What's wrong, Max?" she whispered. "You can't keep this up forever. I need you to be okay." Max let out a soft, almost inaudible whine, and Lisa felt tears sting the corners of her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, determined not to cry. "We'll figure this out," she said firmly, her voice shaking only slightly. "I promise." That night, Lisa lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of Max's breathing from the foot of the bed. She had brought him upstairs with her, hoping that being close might comfort him somehow. But even now, he lay there unmoving, curled into a tight ball. Lisa couldn't stop replaying the day in her mind. The look in Max's eyes, the way he refused food, the sound of his sad whines. Something was wrong. Really wrong. And she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't something physical. Dr. Peter's words echoed in her mind. Has anything changed recently? The loss of someone close to him. Lisa frowned, staring up at the dark ceiling. Could it be possible? She thought back to the past few weeks, trying to pinpoint any moment, any shift in their lives that might explain Max's behavior. But nothing came to mind. Everything had been normal, or so she thought. With a frustrated sigh, she turned onto her side and looked down at Max. The dim light of the moon streamed through the window, casting soft shadows across the room. Max's fur glistened faintly in the light, but his body remained still, his breathing slow and shallow. Lisa reached down, her hand brushing against his back. "We'll figure it out," she whispered again, as though saying it would somehow make it true. Max shifted slightly at the sound of her voice, letting out another soft whine. It was a sound that seemed to carry all the sadness in the world. It broke Lisa's heart all over again. The next morning, Lisa woke to the faint sound of Max moving around downstairs. For the first time in days, he wasn't curled up in his usual spot, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Lisa felt hope flutter in her chest. Maybe he was feeling better. Maybe today would be different. She hurried out of bed and rushed downstairs, her bare feet padding softly against the wooden floor. "Max," she called out, her voice tinged with hope. But as she turned the corner into the living room, her heart sank. Max was sitting by the sliding glass door that led to the backyard. His body was still, his head lowered slightly as he stared outside. The metal food bowl sat untouched in the corner, the kibble still sitting there from the night before. Lisa frowned, stepping closer. "Max." The dog didn't move. He didn't even turn his head to look at her. His gaze was fixed firmly on something outside, and Lisa could see the sadness in his eyes. "What are you looking at?" she murmured, crouching beside him. She followed his gaze, her heart pounding as she tried to see what had caught his attention. The backyard looked normal at first. Green grass, the wooden fence, and a scattering of trees. But then, as her eyes scanned the far corner of the yard, she saw it. A small worn patch of dirt. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Max let out a soft whimper, his tail curled tightly against his body. Lisa's chest tightened as she looked back at him, her heart pounding. Something about that patch of dirt sent a shiver down her spine, a feeling that something was off, something she had missed. Slowly, she stood up and grabbed her shoes. "Come on, Max," she said softly, her voice shaking. "Let's go see." Max didn't move at first, but as Lisa slid the glass door open, he followed her quietly, his head lowered and his movement slow. As they crossed the yard, Lisa's hands began to tremble. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but deep down, she could feel the weight of it, something heartbreaking, something important. And when they reached the patch of dirt, Max stopped. He sat down beside it, his eyes locked on the ground as though he already knew what was there. Lisa swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "What happened here, Max?" The dog let out a long, mournful whine, and Lisa's chest tightened painfully. Something had happened here. Something she wasn't ready for. Lisa stood frozen, staring at the small patch of disturbed earth as the cool morning breeze brushed against her skin. Max sat beside her, his body still, and his eyes filled with a sadness that cut through her heart like a knife. He let out another soft whimper, lowering his head until his snout almost touched the ground. Lisa swallowed hard, throat tight. She dropped to her knees beside Max, her trembling hands brushing against the dirt. "What is this?" she whispered, though she didn't expect an answer. Her voice wavered as she glanced back at him. "What happened here, Max?" The dog didn't move. He simply stared at the ground, his body unmoving except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. A knot of dread twisted in Lisa's stomach as she brushed away the top layer of dirt, her fingers digging into the soft soil. The earth was fresh, as though something had been recently buried there. She hesitated, her heart racing, before she dug a little deeper, her breath coming in short gasps. And then she found it. Her fingers brushed against something soft, fabric. She froze, her pulse pounding in her ears. With trembling hands, she pulled it from the dirt, her eyes widening as she realized what was. A small, faded red bandana. Lisa sat back on her heels, the bandana clutched tightly in her hands as tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She recognized it instantly. It belonged to Charlie, her other dog, who had passed away 2 weeks ago. "Oh, Max," she breathed, her voice breaking. Max let out a soft, mournful whine, as though acknowledging her discovery. He nudged the bandana gently with his nose before curling up beside the patch of earth, his body pressed close as though trying to comfort himself. Lisa's chest ached as she looked down at him, tears streaming down her cheeks. It all made sense now, why Max hadn't been eating, why he seemed so sad and distant. He was mourning. He was grieving the loss of his best friend, just as Lisa had been. "Oh, Max," she whispered again, reaching out to stroke his fur. "I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." Her voice trailed off as she clutched the bandana to her chest, the memories of Charlie flooding back all at once. Charlie had been Max's companion for years, his playmate, his partner in mischief, his family. They had been inseparable, always curled up together on the couch or chasing each other through the yard. When Charlie had passed, it had been sudden. A sickness that took him in a matter of days. Lisa had grieved. She cried herself to sleep for nights on end, missing the little wag of his tail and the joyful bark that always greeted her at the door. But in the chaos of her own grief, she hadn't stopped to consider what Charlie's loss might mean for Max. And now, looking at him curled up beside the makeshift grave, she realized the truth. Max was mourning too. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Animals felt lost just as deeply as humans did, but they couldn't say it out loud. Max couldn't tell her that he missed his friend, that the house felt emptier without Charlie. All he could do was sit here, beside this little patch of earth, and grieve in his own quiet way. "I'm so sorry, Max," Lisa whispered, her tears dripping onto the bandana as she cradled it in her hands. "I didn't know you were hurting too." "I didn't know." Max let out a soft huff, his eyes closing as he rested his head on the ground. Lisa sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his back as they sat together in silence. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, but neither of them moved. For the first time in days, Lisa truly saw Max, not just as her dog, but as a creature capable of deep love, loyalty, and loss. That afternoon, Lisa sat in the living room with the red bandana spread across her lap. Max lay at her feet, his body stretched out and his eyes half closed. The morning's discovery had left her shaken, but it had also opened her eyes to something she hadn't fully understood before. Max needed closure. And maybe, in a way, she did too. Lisa reached for her phone and pulled up an old album of photos. The screen filled with images of Charlie and Max together, playing in the yard, cuddled up on the couch, and running through the park on sunny afternoons. Each photo tugged at her heart, but it also made her smile. She glanced down at Max, who was watching her quietly, his ears perked slightly as though he could sense what she was doing. "You miss him, don't you?" she said softly, holding up a photo of the two dogs curled up together. "I do too." Max let out a low, soft whine, his tail thumping faintly against the floor. Lisa smiled faintly, wiping at the tears that pricked her eyes. "I think we need to do something for him, Max, something to say goodbye. What do you think?" Max tilted his head slightly, his golden brown eyes locking onto hers as though he understood every word. That evening, Lisa and Max stood in the backyard near the patch of earth where Charlie's bandana had been buried. The sun was setting, casting the sky in soft shades of orange and purple. Lisa held a small wooden box in her hands, its lid carved with delicate patterns. Inside were a few of Charlie's favorite things, a chewed-up tennis ball, a worn-out toy, and the red bandana she had found earlier. Max sat quietly beside her, his gaze fixed on the little grave. Lisa knelt down, setting the box gently on the ground. "We didn't get to say goodbye to him properly," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I think he deserves that, don't you?" Max let out a quiet huff, his tail brushing against the ground. Lisa took a deep breath, blinking back tears as she began to speak. "Charlie was the best dog I ever had," she said, her voice soft and steady. "He was loyal, playful, and so full of love. He made this house feel like home, and he was your best friend, Max. You two were inseparable. I know you miss him. I miss him too." She paused, reaching out to scratch Max gently behind the ears. But I think Charlie wouldn't want us to be sad forever. He'd want us to remember the good times, to be happy for everything we had. Max looked up at her, his eyes glistening in the fading light. Lisa smiled faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Goodbye, Charlie. We love you, and we'll never forget you." With that, she gently placed the box into the earth, covering it carefully with soil. She added a small wooden marker she had carved earlier that day, its surface etched with Charlie's name and a tiny paw print. When she was done, she sat back, wiping her hands on her jeans as she glanced at Max. The dog stared at the little grave for a long moment, his body still. Then, slowly, he stepped forward and lay down beside it, resting his head on the soft earth. Lisa's heart swelled with a mix of sadness and love as she watched him. She knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur as they sat together in silence. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the yard. "You're going to be okay, Max," Lisa whispered softly, leaning down to press a kiss to the top of his head. "We're going to be okay." Max let out a soft, contented sigh, his tail thumping gently against the ground. For the first time in days, Lisa felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't that the pain of losing Charlie had disappeared. It never really would, but she knew now that they could move forward, together. The days that followed were quieter, calmer, and filled with moments of reflection. Max, though still subdued, began to show small signs of returning to his old self. The morning after they buried Charlie's mementos, Lisa awoke to find Max waiting by his food bowl. It wasn't his usual enthusiastic stance, his tail didn't wag wildly, and he didn't bark excitedly, but he was sitting there, looking at her expectantly. Lisa froze in the doorway of the kitchen, almost afraid to believe what she was seeing. "Max," she whispered, her voice filled with cautious hope. Max looked up at her, his golden brown eyes soft but steady. A smile broke across Lisa's face, and she hurried over to grab the bag of food from the pantry. "You're hungry, aren't you, boy?" she said, pouring the kibble into his bowl with a shaking hand. Max leaned down, sniffed the food, and then to Lisa's overwhelming relief, he began to eat. Slowly at first, as though unsure, but then with a steady rhythm. Lisa stood there, tears welling in her eyes as she watched him. "Oh, Max," she whispered. "I'm so glad." It wasn't just the act of eating that made her feel so emotional. It was the quiet message it carried. Max was still grieving. Lisa could see it in his eyes, in the way he moved with a certain slowness, but he was healing. He was choosing to keep going, to find comfort in the life he still had, even if part of it felt emptier now. And so, bit by bit, life began to return to normal, or at least a new version of normal. One afternoon, a few days later, Lisa stood in the backyard with Max at her side. The wooden marker they had placed for Charlie stood at the far end of the yard, surrounded by soft grass and the dappled light of the setting sun. Lisa had started planting a small flower garden around it, bright daisies, lilies, and marigolds that Charlie would have loved. She knelt beside the flowers, carefully smoothing out the soil as Max lay beside her, watching quietly. His tail thumped faintly against the ground every now and then, a small sign of contentment. "Charlie would have loved this," Lisa said softly, glancing down at Max. "Remember how he used to dig holes all over the yard? You'd get so mad at him when he made a mess, but then you'd end up playing with him anyway." Max huffed softly, as though acknowledging her words. Lisa smiled faintly, sitting back on her heels. "I think he's happy here, Max. And I think he'd want us to be happy, too." Max looked up at her, his golden brown eyes meeting hers with an understanding that seemed almost human. For a moment, they sat there in silence, the cool breeze ruffling their hair and fur. Lisa reached out to scratch Max behind the ears, and he leaned into her touch, his eyes closing in quiet contentment. "You're such a good boy," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what I'd do without you." It was true. In the weeks since Charlie's passing, Max had been her anchor. Even in his own grief, he had stayed by her side, comforting her in his quiet, steadfast way. Lisa realized now just how much dogs understood, how deeply they felt love, loss, and connection. "You've got such a big heart," she whispered, leaning down to press her forehead gently against his. "You and Charlie both." Max let out a soft, contented sigh, and Lisa felt the last of her sadness begin to lift, like a weight finally being carried away on the breeze. The next morning, Lisa woke to the sound of Max's paws patting across the floor. She opened her eyes to see him standing by the bedroom door, his tail wagging faintly as he looked back at her. "What is it, boy?" Lisa murmured sleepily, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. Max let out a low bark, a happy one, the first she'd heard in weeks, and trotted out of the room. Lisa smiled, a flicker of warmth filling her chest as she climbed out of bed to follow him. When she reached the living room, she froze, her breath catching in her throat. Max was sitting by the sliding glass door, his tail wagging slowly as he looked outside. And on the other side of the glass, sitting calmly in the middle of the backyard, was a small golden puppy. Lisa blinked, wondering if she was still dreaming. The puppy stared back at Max with big, curious eyes, its tiny tail wagging as it cocked its head to the side. "Where did you come from?" Lisa murmured, stepping closer to the door. She glanced down at Max, who was sitting perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the little dog as though he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Slowly, Lisa slid the door open and stepped outside. The puppy's ears perked up, and it let out a soft yip before bounding toward her, its paws kicking up little clumps of grass. Lisa knelt down as the puppy reached her, its tiny body wiggling with excitement as it licked her hands and wagged its tail. "Hey there," she said softly, laughing through her surprise. "Who are you, little one?" The puppy barked happily, spinning in a circle before flopping onto its back in the grass, its paws in the air. Lisa smiled, reaching out to rub its soft belly as Max trotted over, his head lowering to sniff the newcomer cautiously. The puppy wiggled happily beneath his nose, and after a moment, Max let out a soft huff, an approving sound, almost like a sigh of relief. He nudged the puppy gently with his snout before sitting down beside it, his tail brushing against the ground in slow, contented movements. Lisa watched them, her heart swelling. It was the first time she had seen Max truly relaxed in weeks, his posture easy, and his eyes warm as he watched the little puppy roll around in the grass. "Looks like you've made a new friend," Lisa said softly, reaching out to scratch Max behind the ears. Max glanced up at her, his golden brown eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, maybe, or understanding. Lisa smiled, wiping a tear from her cheek as she looked back at the puppy. "Where did you come from, huh? Did someone lose you?" The puppy barked again, rolling back onto its paws and bounding over to nuzzle Max's side. Max lowered his head, licking the puppy's ear gently before letting out a soft, contented sigh. Lisa's smile widened as she watched them together. It was as though this little puppy had been sent to them, a tiny ray of sunshine to help heal the lingering sadness that had settled over their home. "Maybe you were meant to find us," Lisa murmured, reaching out to stroke the puppy's soft fur. "Maybe you're exactly what we needed." Max let out another approving huff, his tail wagging a little faster as the puppy nestled against him. Lisa felt her heart lift in a way it hadn't in weeks, like a heavy weight had finally been lifted, leaving room for something new. She sat back in the grass, watching as Max and the puppy played together beneath the soft morning light. The little dog darted around him, yipping happily as Max followed at a slower pace, his movements gentle and deliberate. It was a beautiful sight, one that filled Lisa with a deep, overwhelming sense of peace. Charlie would never be forgotten. His memory would live on in the flowers they had planted, in the wooden marker that bore his name, and in the stories they would tell. But life had a way of moving forward, even when it hurt. And now, watching Max play with a new puppy, Lisa felt a quiet sense of hope. "Maybe we'll call you Sonny," she said softly, glancing at the little dog as it tumbled happily into Max's side. "What do you think, Max?" Max turned to look at her, his golden brown eyes warm and full of life. He let out a low, happy bark, and Lisa smiled, feeling the weight of grief finally begin to lift. It wasn't goodbye. Not really. Because love, true love, the kind shared between a person and their dog, never truly left. It lived on in every wag of a tail, every bark of joy, and every quiet moment spent sitting in the sun. And in that moment, surrounded by the laughter of a puppy and the quiet loyalty of her best friend, Lisa knew they were going to be okay. Together. The days that followed were filled with a new kind of energy, one that Lisa hadn't felt in a long time. Sonny, as she had named the tiny golden puppy, seemed to bring light back into their lives. The house, which had felt heavy and silent after Charlie's passing, was now filled with the sound of little paws skittering across the floors and the playful barks of a puppy discovering the world. Max, for his part, had taken to Sonny almost immediately. At first, he had been careful around the puppy, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, as though trying to understand what this tiny bundle of fur meant for their lives. But over time, Lisa noticed the small moments where Max began to let his guard down. It started with the way he would lie down in the middle of the living room, his massive body stretched across the carpet as Sonny bounced around him, tugging at his ears and swatting at his tail with clumsy little paws. Max would huff and protest at first, his tail flicking like a warning, but then, almost begrudgingly, it would begin to wag. Lisa watched them one afternoon from the kitchen as she washed dishes. Sonny was darting in circles around Max, a chewed-up toy dangling from his mouth. Max let out a low grumble, pretending to ignore him, but his tail was thumping rhythmically against the floor. "You're not fooling anyone, Max," Lisa called out with a smile. "I know you're having fun." Max lifted his head and shot her a look that could only be described as indignant, as though he didn't appreciate being called out. Sonny, meanwhile, let out a sharp bark of victory and pounced on Max's tail. Lisa laughed softly, drying her hands and walking over to sit on the floor beside them. Max shifted his weight, rolling onto his side with a heavy sigh, while Sonny clambered over him, yipping excitedly. Lisa reached out to scratch Max's ears, smiling as she looked at the two of them. "You're doing good, Max," she said softly. "Charlie would be proud of you." Max's golden brown eyes met hers, and for a moment, there was something so deep, so understanding in his gaze that Lisa felt tears prick at her eyes again. Max didn't bark or whine. He simply laid his head down, letting Sonny gnaw playfully at his paw. Lisa reached out to stroke Sonny's soft fur. "You're a little troublemaker, you know that," she murmured, grinning as the puppy wiggled beneath her touch. "But I think you're exactly what Max needed." And what I needed, she thought silently, glancing back at Max. The hole that Charlie had left behind hadn't been filled completely. Lisa knew it never really could be. Charlie had been special, a once-in-a-lifetime kind of friend. But Sonny had brought something new to their lives, joy, laughter, and a sense of hope that Lisa hadn't realized she'd been missing. For the first time in weeks, the house felt alive again. One evening, as the sun began to set, Lisa sat on the back porch with a steaming mug of tea in her hands. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, and a cool breeze rustled through the trees. Max and Sonny were playing in the yard, their silhouettes moving through the soft grass like shadows. Sonny darted ahead, his little legs carrying him faster than seemed possible as he chased after a ball Lisa had thrown earlier. Max followed at a slower pace, his movements more deliberate but no less joyful. Every so often, Max would stop and nudge the ball towards Sonny, as though giving the puppy a chance to win. Lisa smiled as she watched them, heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. She thought about everything they had been through over the past few weeks, the quiet grief, the moments of sadness that felt impossible to overcome, and the unexpected arrival of Sonny. Life, she realized, had a way of surprising you, of giving you exactly what you needed, even when you didn't know you needed it. Lisa set her mug down on the porch railing and walked out into the yard. Sonny spotted her immediately and bounded toward her with the ball clutched in his mouth, his tail wagging so hard it looked like it might fall off. "Hey there, little guy," Lisa said, kneeling down to scoop him up. Sonny wriggled excitedly in her arms, his paws patting her cheeks as he tried to lick her face. Okay, she laughed, setting him back down. "I get it, you missed me." Max trotted over, his tail wagging slowly as he sat beside her, his massive form solid and reassuring. Lisa reached out to scratch his ears, her smile softening. "You're the best boy, Max," she said quietly. "I hope you know that." Max let out a low huff, his eyes warm as they met hers. Lisa turned to look at the small flower garden they had planted for Charlie, its colors glowing softly in the fading light. A peaceful sense of closure settled over her as she took in the sight. "We're going to be okay," she said softly, more to herself than to Max or Sonny. "All of us." Sonny barked happily, as though in agreement, and darted off again, chasing after a butterfly that had wandered into the yard. Max followed at a slower pace, his tail swishing gently as he watched over the little puppy with quiet patience. Lisa stood there for a long time, the cool breeze brushing against her skin as the sky turned darker, the first stars beginning to appear overhead. She thought of Charlie, of his wagging tail, his joyful bark, and the unconditional love he had given her and Max for so many years. He was gone, but his memory was alive. It was in the flowers they had planted, in the stories they would tell, and in the love they would carry forward. And as Lisa watched Max and Sonny playing together in the twilight, she realized something else. Love wasn't finite. It didn't disappear when someone you loved was gone. It didn't shrink or fade with time. Instead, it grew. It changed shape. It found new ways to exist, to spread, to heal. Charlie would always be a part of their lives, but Sunny was a part of their future. A new chapter, full of laughter, joy, and endless possibilities. Lisa smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek as she whispered, "Thank you, Charlie, for everything." Max stopped playing and looked over at her, his ears perked as though he'd heard her. Lisa smiled through her tears and waved him over. He trotted toward her, and Sunny followed, his tiny paws pattering against the grass. Lisa knelt down as Max reached her, wrapping her arms around his neck and burying her face in his fur. "I love you, Max," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're my rock. You always have been." Max huffed softly, nuzzling his head against her shoulder. Sunny barked happily, jumping up to join them, and Lisa laughed, wiping the tears from her face as she gathered the little puppy in her arms. The three of them sat there together in the cool grass, the stars shining brightly above them. Lisa felt the warmth of Max's presence beside her, the soft weight of Sunny in her lap, and the lingering memory of Charlie in her heart. It wasn't goodbye. It was a beginning. And as the night wrapped around them like a soft blanket, Lisa knew one thing for certain. They would be okay. Together. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Slowly but surely, life settled into a new rhythm. A rhythm where love, laughter, and healing intertwined in the little home Lisa shared with Max and Sunny. Sunny grew quickly, his once tiny paws now sturdy and confident as he bounded around the yard like a ball of golden energy. He brought a sense of playfulness that seemed to lift even the heaviest of days. No matter what the weather was like, no matter how tired Lisa felt after a long day, Sunny's enthusiasm was impossible to resist. For Max, Sunny had become more than just a companion. He was a reminder that life went on, even after loss. While the puppy's boundless energy sometimes overwhelmed him, Max had taken on a patient, almost fatherly role. He would play with Sunny when the little dog demanded it, letting him tug at his ears or dart circles around him in the yard, but he also taught Sunny the quiet comforts of stillness. Lisa often watched them from the kitchen window, Max lounging in the sun, his tail thumping lazily against the grass, while Sunny snuggled up beside him, finally tired out from a day of play. The sight always brought a smile to her face. One particular afternoon, Lisa decided to take both dogs to Charlie's favorite spot, the small hidden park near the edge of town. It had been a while since they'd been there, but Lisa felt like it was time, a way to honor Charlie's memory while also creating new ones with Max and Sunny. "Come on, boys," she called, clipping their leashes to their collars as they wagged their tails excitedly. "Let's go for a little adventure." Sunny barked happily, pulling against the leash with boundless energy, while Max stood calmly beside her, his eyes warm and steady. The contrast between the two dogs never failed to make Lisa laugh. One so wild and carefree, the other so steady and wise. The walk to the park was peaceful. The sun was shining, the breeze was cool, and the sound of birdsong filled the air. Sunny trotted ahead, his little legs carrying him faster than seemed possible, while Max followed at his usual unhurried pace, his tail swishing gently as he walked. When they reached the park, Lisa led them to the far side where a small, quiet grove of trees surrounded an open field. It was the same spot where she used to sit with Charlie, watching him chase butterflies or roll around in the grass. The memory made her chest tighten, but it also brought a sense of peace. "Here we are," Lisa said softly, unclipping their leashes. Sunny bolted immediately, barking with excitement as he raced through the grass, his golden fur shining in the sunlight. Max followed more slowly, his gaze calm and watchful as he settled himself beneath a tree, his eyes following Sunny's every move. Lisa spread out a blanket on the ground and sat down, leaning back on her hands as she took in the sight before her. The park was quiet, the sunlight filtering through the trees in soft, golden beams. The breeze carried with it the faint scent of wildflowers, and for the first time in a long while, Lisa felt truly at ease. She glanced over at Max, who was now lying in the grass with Sunny curled up beside him. The puppy had finally tired himself out. His little body snuggled against Max's side as he dozed peacefully. Max let out a soft huff, his eyes meeting Lisa's with a look that spoke volumes. "We're okay, aren't we, Max?" Lisa said softly, smiling as she watched them. "We made it through." Max blinked slowly, his tail brushing against the ground in quiet agreement. Lisa leaned back, letting her eyes drift closed as the warmth of the sun washed over her. She thought of Charlie, of his joyful bark, his wagging tail, and the way he had filled their lives with so much love. He was gone, But his memory was still here, in the park, in the flowers they had planted, and in the bond she now shared with Max and Sunny. Love didn't end. It simply changed shape. That evening, as Lisa sat curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, Sunny dozed in her lap while Max lay stretched out on the floor nearby. The house was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the heater and the occasional sigh of contentment from one of the dogs. Lisa glanced over at the small wooden shelf near the window where a photo of Charlie sat, surrounded by a few of his favorite things. The red bandana was tucked neatly beside the frame, a quiet reminder of the love he had brought into their lives. "Hey, Charlie," Lisa whispered softly, her eyes lingering on the photo. "I hope you're watching over us. I hope you know how much we miss you." She reached down to scratch Sunny behind the ears, smiling as the little dog let out a sleepy huff and curled up tighter against her. Max lifted his head, his golden brown eyes meeting hers with that same quiet understanding he always carried. "We're okay now," Lisa said softly, her voice steady. "We're going to be okay." Max let out a low huff, his tail thumping gently against the floor as though to say, "I know." Lisa smiled, leaning back against the cushions as a wave of peace washed over her. She had lost Charlie, and it had hurt in ways she hadn't expected, but she had found her way through the grief. Max had been her rock through it all, and Sunny had brought light back into their lives when they needed it most. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But it was beautiful in its own way, a mix of joy and sorrow, love and loss, endings and new beginnings. And as Lisa sat there, surrounded by the warmth of her two dogs, she realized that love, true, unconditional love, was the one thing that never really ended. It lived on in every wag of a tail, every quiet moment of comfort, and every new memory waiting to be made. As the night settled over the house, Lisa watched as Max and Sunny curled up together near the fireplace. Sunny's tiny body was nestled against Max's side, his little snores filling the quiet room. Max, for his part, seemed completely at peace, his head resting on his paws as he let out a deep, contented sigh. Lisa sat for a long moment, just watching them, her heart full. "Thank you," she whispered softly, though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to Max, to Sunny, or to Charlie's memory. Maybe all three. The room was quiet, but Lisa could feel the love that surrounded her, a quiet, enduring presence that filled every corner of their little home. As she turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to bed, she glanced back one last time at the two dogs curled up near the fire. Max lifted his head, his golden brown eyes meeting hers with a look of quiet reassurance. "I love you, Max," Lisa whispered, smiling through the tears that pricked her eyes. "Always." Max blinked slowly, his tail thumping once against the floor before he rested his head back down. Sunny snored softly beside him, his little paws twitching in his sleep. And as Lisa climbed into bed, she knew that they were going to be okay. Because love, no matter how it changed, no matter where it went, always found a way to bring them home.